Since 1955, the Fed has consistently lifted interest rates in a series of moves, not just a one-off, in a series of moves 11 times. So since 1955, interest rates have gone up 11 times. 10 of those times, house prices continued to go up. The other time, house prices just went sideways, and that was way back in the late 1950s. We're in a slightly different era now. This is what nobody gets. So when you look at the statistics, when you look at the history, when interest rates come down, house prices go up. When interest rates go up, house prices go up as well. And so when the economy is improving, and you can see this right throughout history, right back to the Fed, and actually when the Fed wasn't in existence, economists understood that when interest rates were going up, they were going up for a reason, because the economy was really strong. And so this is what the Fed are doing. The economy is strong, they have to lift interest rates. When the economy is really strong, house prices will continue to go up. I'm absolutely staggered that that economists, mainstream, anybody else can't understand this. When you put American house prices, when you match them against interest rates, you see that interest rates usually go up pretty much in the middle, the second half of the real estate cycle. House prices will continue to go up because the economy is really strong. So economists don't get it, right? And then you'll get the media coming out, putting up all these sorts of propositions and being really emotional, and they'll panic everybody, right? But I'm telling you, history shows that when interest rates go up, house prices generally go up. Now, having said that, let me move on to the questions of war and China. I'm old enough now to remember a couple of real estate cycles. I urge people watching to go back and check up a little bit of history. So you do that in roughly 20-year cycles, roughly. All these numbers, I know it's a bit hard when I bring out all these numbers, but have a look what happened in 2001, 2 and 3 and 4. You have a look what happened in 1982, 83, 84. And you have a look what happened in the 1960s. And just briefly, in 2001, 2 and 3, what was going on? Iraq. Firstly, 9/11, which absolutely was scary. Really, nobody knew what the Americans were going to do once the towers came down. And then 2003, they decided to go into Iraq. The news back then, absolutely everybody thought World War III was going to start because the Americans were angry. They'd woken a sleeping giant, which is exactly what happened in 1941, 42 and 43 when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. It was the same expression being used, waking a sleeping giant. You go back and have a look, 1982, 83, 84, and all these things I'm talking about is the second half of the real estate cycle. So in 1983, Lebanon was involved. The Americans then went into Libya and started bombing Libya. And I specifically remember that because I was trying to travel the world back then and I couldn't get into the Middle East because the Americans were absolutely angry about what the Lebanese and the Iranians were doing with bombing American embassies and all the other stuff. In the 1960s, the bogeyman was Cuba. And so what was the American, I think in this instance, the American military establishment, they are interested in fostering war. And it's very easy to foster war when you've got a group of people in the Middle East that don't want peace. So all you've got to do is rile them a little bit because they get angry really quickly. And you get a situation like we have today when we've got war stuff. I urge readers and listeners, I urge them to have a really good look at what was happening in the Middle East and Israel and a bit of the Palestinian situation. Now, I don't want to get too political about this because people get hot-headed about what's happening. I want you to watch it from an economic viewpoint. Israel developed and ended up in the last couple of months with a right-wing politician that had to go even more extreme and invite extremists, total extremists, and every side has extremists, right? And they're a minority, but he invited extremists into his cabinet, and he did that because he had to keep himself out of jail. And they took their eye off the ball. Now, that is a typical second half of the real estate cycle scenario. Now, picture what might happen in the US, right? You now have a former president that has to get elected to keep himself out of jail, and he is turning more and more right-wing extremists. And he will invite those sort of people into his own cabinet. And as you go into the second half of the real estate cycle, and we get up to 2026, it may happen that everybody will be watching the exact thing that they don't want to be watching, because this is what the media will feed you. When you go into the next few years of the cycle, you have to understand the cycle and you have to be watching the earnings of land. So as I explained at the beginning, economists don't watch this, though they'll never tell you what you need to know. because newspapers would be full of absolute rubbish and garbage and emotional stuff that gets you really riled up. And it's, in my view, it's a little bit deliberate. It gets you away from what it is you need to know, okay? So interest rates, nobody ever tells you what happened in history. The war stuff, well, I've explained it now, so you get to know what's got to come up and what you've got to watch for the next couple of years. Now let me turn to China. The Chinese people know that the Chinese media is propaganda. They know, yes? There are too many people in the West that forget that Western media is also propaganda. It's controlled by just a couple of people, a couple of very big news media outlets now. And what gets put into the papers is basically to fill the space between advertisements that you want to watch. So they've got to fill it with something. They're not going to fill it with what they don't want you to read. It's what the stuff is in there that they want you to know about. It's not controlled. And now you've got the situation where you've got Israel and Palestine, Hamas at war. Now you're going to see the Western propaganda go into absolute overdrive. Now, I've travelled the world. I've lived in places Muslim denominated, and it's very interesting to do that, because when you do, if you look around Malaysia and Indonesia and other sorts of places, what you see all around the nation, all around the country, is billboards saying "Free Palestine." Can you imagine what might happen if I decided to pay for a billboard in the middle of Melbourne or Sydney that says "Free Palestine"? It would be absolute chaos, and I'd probably go to jail and have to take it down. Now, this is not me making a political comment about one side or the other. I'm just trying to get your listeners and other people, wake up. It's propaganda. The whole war thing is, now you're going to get the military industrial complex. They love this because they've now got to manufacture a lot more bullets. And you'll get the politicians and all of the diplomats, they'll all come together now to try and de-escalate the situation. They love that too, because it puts them in the public eye, it makes them famous, they get all the news media coverage, and hopefully if one of them can actually develop something that might even go anyway towards de-escalating the conflict, he'll be nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. The whole thing is shite. I'll tell you, it's just absolute constructions that you've got to watch within the concept of the 18.6-year real estate cycle. Now, that brings me to China and a little bit of stuff, right? The Chinese side's propaganda, the Western side's propaganda, but the question you have to ask yourself, which nobody does, what happens if President Xi gets it right? What happens if what he's doing does get it right? I think what he's done now with real estate in China, with Evergrande and with the couple of firms that were like that, they had to be brought down to earth because they were the world's most indebted companies. And I think he's done that in a measured, smart sort of way. And he's moving the economy to electric vehicles, to consumer stuff that the Chinese middle class have to do. If he gets that right, and he may not, but if he does, if he gets that right, it could make China the biggest economy in the world. This is a real threat to the US, and America does not want them to get that right. Hence, they're doing the stuff they're doing with semiconductors and everything else, where they're making it really hard for China to do, right? I mean, let's face it, in history, Americans, as they were developing as a power, they stole all of the UK's secrets to all of the cotton gin and all the other stuff, right? So it's not as if America hasn't done its own stealing of technology. But in one sense, the Americans are quite right too. You can't have the Chinese stealing technology and chips that they didn't make, which they are doing. But the question you've got to ask is not whether Chinese economy is going to collapse because they've got one or two heavily indebted property developers that really do have to be in check. The question you might ask is, what if Xi gets this right? And he may. And the other thing I wanted to say, and thanks for letting me make a couple of comments, the American economy and the Chinese economy, they're not really very different. It is, both of them, based on land. In China, the way they've developed, you've had local governments there selling off land to developers to develop housing, which China desperately needed, and they've done very well over the last 30 years, and it's made Australia very rich. America, the local councils, they mostly the land's been farming. The local council, when a developer wants to put some houses up, he buys the farm, he goes to the local council, he gets that designated as land for housing, and they build housing and they develop housing. The process is exactly the same, isn't it? The thing in America is the developer is done by private, and so the developer will put his own men on council to make sure he gets the results, which allows government to become corrupted. In China, the development is done by local government, so people have to get onto local government because it's a prodigious amount of money that gets earned, and then you dangle in front of them the local councillors in China that can run off with some of the money. It's absolutely massive stuff. What's the difference? It's exactly the same process. One's communist, one's capitalist, but it's still based on land. Nobody gets it.